Our speaker today is Professor John Connelly from the University of California at Berkeley, and my colleague, Professor Gary Cohen, and my predecessor at the Center for Austrian Studies. I should note that we have Professor David Good here as well, another former director of the Center for Austrian Studies. We're delighted that David and Rosemary are able to join us today as well. But let me hand things over to my colleague and good friend, Gary Cohen, for the introduction.
It's a great privilege to be able to introduce our speaker today, and a great pleasure that we're able to meet both in person and virtually through Zoom connections on the internet. It's also been a great pleasure for me over some decades now to follow the work of our speaker and to benefit from his enormous and indeed varied contributions to scholarship on modern Central and Eastern Europe. He came to the University of California, Berkeley as an acting assistant professor in August 1994. Within a few months, he finished his degree, his Harvard PhD, with a truly magisterial dissertation on the communist takeover of university education in East Germany, Poland, and the Czech Republic, or what was then Czechoslovakia. With amazingly, and think about this is a graduate student who accomplished this, with archival research in Germany, Poland, the Czech capital Prague, and in Moscow. And prowess, not just in languages, but an ability to work through large quantities of archival sources without drowning in them. His ability to tease out meaning, to interpret a complex historical record, to synthesize it, to make sense of what he's found in the archives in light of what we think or what we ought to be thinking about what was going on in the context of the events that he studied. When he came up for tenure, he amazingly had journal articles out in all the major journals that someone working in his fields where they would aspire to publish. For the second book, he turned to a topic a little different from the work in political and socio-political history that he'd done up to that time, although not utterly remote, because there had been some work in intellectual history in several of the articles, and indeed on the history of racism and racial thinking. The second project produced an insightful and unflinching study of the engagement of Catholic theologians with issues of race, anti-Semitism, and the relationship of the church to the Jews. It was designed to look at the background and roots of the important Vatican II document Nostra Aetate in our times. And this project too produced a prize-winning book, From Enemy to Brother, The Revolution in Catholic Teaching on the Jews, 1933-1965, published by the Harvard University Press in 2012. The article publication continued, but the next project was an even more ambitious study, a grand synthetic history of East Central and Eastern Europe from the late 18th to the 20th century. A much needed project, I would say, given the large quantity of less than convincing work that's been published trying to do that over the last several decades. That project resulted in the book From Peoples into Nations, A History of Eastern Europe, Princeton Press 2020, in 956 well-filled pages, and a heroic effort based on amazingly wide reading in the scholarship on Central and Eastern Europe in more languages than I can remember. And I recommend that book to you if you're looking for a grand synthesis. Today, that book in the 19th century sections brought him to think about the evolution, the history of the Habsburg monarchy governing parts of Central and Eastern Europe in the 19th century. And today we'll get some more focused reflections on the question of was the Habsburg Empire an empire? It's a great pleasure for me to present to you the Sidney Hellman Ehrman Professor of European History at UC Berkeley, John Connelly. Welcome, John.
Well, thank you for such nice words, especially kind, generous words, Gary, coming from somebody, especially nice for me, coming from somebody whose work has edified me from day one of my academic career as a graduate student. I remember distinctly encountering your first book and what an impact it had upon me, and I've carried with the wisdom of that book with me since that time. I also want to say thanks to the Center for Austrian Studies for inviting me to speak here in person, to Howard Dillon, former director Gary, for the invitation to speak this very prestigious lecture. Robert A. Kann, of course, is somebody that we as people who work in Central Europe encountered usually very early in our careers. I encountered him on a bookshelf at a place called Marlowe Bookstore, now defunct bookstore in Northeast Philadelphia, where there was a stack of his Habsburg Empire books sometime in the, I don't know, the 80s or the 70s, but it was the very first, it was the first introduction I had to Habsburg history, and also the wisdom of Professor Kann has stayed with me since those days. So it's a wonderful honor to be here. I also just briefly want to thank friends of mine in Vienna, Philip Ter, Irena Remestwensky, Janis Panas Giatis, and Peter Becker of the Research Center for History of Transformations at the university there, who gave me the idea of this talk earlier this summer inadvertently, and I can explain how that happened. I actually made a blunder in a talk that I gave in a cafe. Where else would you give a talk in Vienna but in a big cafe? And I said something that I had trouble defending. So it led to the question that I want to talk about today, which is, was the Habsburg Empire an empire? So the point of the talk is not to give a yes or no answer. Instead, I want to try to do something that, as far as I know, has not been attempted. I'm going to make reference to how the monarchy fits into ideas of global empire more generally, but my real interest, my core interest, is how the monarchy related to the Central European of empire, embodied in the German word Reich, R-E-I-C-H, Reich. Strange fact I want to investigate is how, although the Habsburg monarchy never was officially a Reich, nevertheless, much in accord with what Peter Judson has written, it was referred to as a Reich, as unser Reich, our empire, by just about everybody after about the year 1870. That is, when in fact, the monarchy was not even a state and was not technically a Reich. As you may know, the word empire misses much of the meaning of the German word Reich. The translation is a rough one. I'll say a bit more about Reich's etymology in a moment, but in political terms, in 19th century Central Europe, it was hard to utter a word with deeper historical resonance. For Germans, the word Reich became ever more resonant as the years went by after 1806, the year when the Holy Roman Empire, the Heiliges Römisches Reich, was officially ceased to exist. Germans thought not of the dysfunctional entity of recent memory. The Roman Empire was thought to be dysfunctional in the late 18th century, but of the supposed glory of the medieval Reich many centuries earlier. The scholar Julius Ficker, who was a medievalist, legal historian, captured some of this magical appeal of the word Reich in lectures that he gave in 1861 in Innsbruck. So this is before the Bismarck's Reich is created, about a decade before that. When thinking of Reich, he said, we recall powerfully ruling emperors at the head of a united nation, filled with the proud feeling of their supremacy, dominating neighboring peoples, determining the fate of this part of the world. End of quote. If I have an argument to be made in terms of the history of the Habsburg monarchy, but also in terms of East Central Europe, which is the context of the monarchy, it's that we should be aware of perspective. It's to capture this imperial perspective that was uttered by Ficker and other German authors, but I think we should also endeavor to capture the perspective of those neighboring peoples, the Nachbarvölker that Ficker speaks of, I think rather carelessly, the subjects of German and Habsburg imperialism. Now note, Julius Ficker was a moderate, but the basic view he espoused of Reich, of a culturally German entity dominating vast spaces, went across political camps in Austria and Germany, even including German and Austrian social democrats. One 20th century version of this general sense is Mitteleuropa. Another is, of course, the Third Reich, das Dritte Reich. So this is a very heavy word we're dealing with. I'll say a few words about general notions of empire first today in the speech, then I'll talk a bit about the etymology of this word Reich, and then in the body of the talk, I'm going to go through 3 episodes about how the Habsburg monarchy and its leaders and subjects related to the idea of Reich through the 19th century, from the moment the old Reich was no more, so from 1806 to the years just before the First World War. Before doing any of that, a few words on where the Habsburg monarchy stands versus other empires in world history. So I'll make 2 points. It awkwardly fits current understandings of empire and is usually, as my research indicated, not included in a lot of larger histories of global empires. Empire, this is a definition from Ronald Suney and Valerie Kivelson from the University of Michigan. Empire claims ultimate sovereignty over population, dominates extensive territories with disparate peoples, is based on hierarchical power relations with rule exercised through difference rather than through integration. Yet the Habsburg monarchy sacrificed united sovereignty after 1867, when it broke into the dual monarchy, Austria and Hungary, did not have a clear hierarchy, and often hoped to integrate populations, assimilate them rather than use difference in order to rule them. More generally, I think historians of empire sense that the monarchy lacked the imperial drive and the sense of boundlessness when registers in British, Russian, or other empires. The monarchy, the Habsburg monarchy, stumbled into many of its possessions and was mostly involved in consolidating rather than expanding. The second thing I think that's unusual about the Habsburg Empire is that it's considered to have been something positive. It kept peace among quarreling nationalities, promoted order and progress. That's a tenor to works in the Habsburgs, on the Habsburgs that you won't find in works about other empires, especially nowadays. When the Habsburg state claimed to spread civilization, historians tend to take this as a neutral fact and don't problematize it as they might, indeed as they would. In other cases, say the British in India. When the British spread civilization in India, that's thought to be a contested fact, a difficult fact these days. However, I would suggest if you take the perspective of the subject nationalities, as I'm suggesting we do, like Czechs or Ukrainians, spreading civilization, the Habsburg idea of spreading civilization seemed an arrogant spreading of a supposedly higher culture. Robert A. Kann, as I read him, didn't participate in valorizing the monarchy very much, but he did use the word empire to describe it. His definition came from Webster's as follows: an extended territory, usually comprised of a group of nations, states, or peoples under the control or domination of a single sovereign power. In an essay of 1966, Kann wrote that the Habsburg Empire had lasted 3 long generations, from Maria Theresia, 1740, and the Wars of Austrian Succession, to 1867 and the division of the realm into Austria and Hungary. Thus, Kann was attentive to that agenda of state building that starts with Maria Theresia, but he was also attentive to the agenda of domination and clearly saw the way that subject nationalities might find the Habsburgs' imperial idea threatening. There was no cultural equality in the monarchy, but rather German dominance. Quoting Kann, the monarchy's imperial idea could not reflect the geographic, social, and political profile of the various peoples in the monarchy in terms acceptable to the nationalities who comprised the majority of its inhabitants. Now, what happens when we cross the language barrier and go from Webster's definition of empire to the use of Reich, the German Reich in Central European history and culture. For a word, as I've suggested, that had such heavy meanings by the year 1800, the word Reich had lowly origins. In the 10th century, it meant simply realm, an area ruled by a king or some other potentate. It derived, anybody guess what Reich derived from? People usually guess Latin. It derived from Celtic, actually. It derived from a Celtic word with that basic meaning of rule, whose traces we see elsewhere in the German language, for example, in proper names like Heinrich, which means simply ruler of the home. There's, of course, also the word Königreich, a realm ruled by a king. Closer to our topic, there was Österreich, Austria, which designated an eastern march of early Bavaria, first record of which we have dates from the late 10th century. But to come to our proper subject of Das Reich, the empire, within this evolution over time, the word Reich in this specific usage emerged to signify a realm above kingdoms and other principalities, a universal empire in the tradition of Rome, Heiliges Römisches Reich, Holy Roman Empire. This term and its Latin equivalent dates from the 12th century. As noted, when one said simply Das Reich in German in the year 1800, what one meant was precisely that ancient structure, often involving rule of vast areas, much of Italy, almost all German areas, much of what became France, all of Czechia, all of the current Czech Republic. But over time, this Reich fell far short of what people nowadays consider to be imperial rule. From the 13th century, the emperors ceded rights to their vassals. They spent actually much more time outside of German lands than inside of German lands, so that by the 18th century, the components of the empire, and you'll know this story, hundreds of German city-states, principalities, archbishoprics, and a few kingdoms were independent of the emperor's will or rule. Still, that supposedly dysfunctional entity was the Reich, the empire that gave Germany and Austria a shared political structure until it disappeared in 1806. Now I want to go for a moment back across the language barrier. If you read, or if you read English and French, you would find that there was nothing unusual about Austria being called an empire from the 18th century onward. And in Kann's text, so if you go to Google books and you look at late 1700s, you will find Austrian Empire in English. In Kann's terms, this usage made sense. Extensive space, complexity, one ruling house. And after 1804, English and French sources will tell you that the official name of the monarchy was indeed Austrian Empire. In fact, that is a rough translation. So what happened in 1804? Previous year, Napoleon Bonaparte crowned himself Emperor of the French. He controlled much of Germany and wanted to reform it gradually into an entity known as the Rhine Confederation. In the course of doing so, he encouraged Middle German states to help themselves to lots of territory of the old empire, the old Reich. Gradually, the Reich, with its many units of sovereignty, gave way to something different, and he demanded that the old Reich be disbanded. For the Habsburg Emperor Francis II, this demand was a threat. If the Holy Roman Empire were disbanded, he would lose his title of emperor. Habsburgs had been crowned Roman emperors since the 13th century. Without that title, he would simply be King of Hungary and Bohemia, subordinate to Napoleon, maybe even a vassal. So in an act of dubious legality, Francis crowned himself Emperor, Kaiser of Austria in 1804. I might note that this was a very odd way of founding an empire. This act was not aggressive, as you would associate with empires. The aspiration was not imperial, as we know the word from other empires. There was no ambition to grow and be boundless. Rather, for Austria, becoming an empire in this sense was a step taken in fear, not to fall a step lower on the hierarchy of European princes. The point was to seem imperial, not to be imperial. And the word, this is the important point as far as the larger theme is concerned, the word used was not Reich, it was Kaisertum, Kaisertum Österreich. Thus, an entity where the focus was not on rule of territory, Reich, but on the glory of the potentate holding an unmatched dignity, the Kaiser. So, imperial dignity without empire. In 1806, the old Reich was indeed finally dissolved, and now a vacuum of legitimacy opened up in Central Europe. The German lands were caught somewhere between the ancien regime, the old regime, and an emerging order of nation states. The new German national movement felt, many average Germans felt, that an organized entity was needed to unite and defend the German lands from a repetition of something, anything like French domination and occupation had gone over 20 years from the early 1790s. For the Habsburg state, the new German nationalism represented a challenge that it would have liked to ignore but couldn't ignore. According to the Austrian historian Barbara Hamann, the monarchy could continue to lay claim to leadership in the vast spaces of Germany. This map gives you some sense of them, as well as maintain its own hereditary possessions. The map doesn't give you a sense of that, but I'll show you a map later on, only by appealing to the tradition of the Old Reich. So Austria needed this word. So what we have in succeeding decades after 1815, after the Congress of Vienna, is evolution away from fear and diffidence to a determination to lay claim to the Reich legacy. In the 1840s, as we will see, this project took shape in a project called the 70 million person Reich. But because this is an Austrian story, there was a certain conceptual murkiness and openness to the whole thing. So let me just gradually sketch that. So there was, on the one hand, there was Das Reich, which meant the Old Reich, as I mentioned before. But there was also that more general, flexible sense of Reich connoting rule of territory that I also mentioned. In that period, people said, for example, this was very unofficial. They would say Polnisches Reich, meaning Polish-dominated territory. They would say Ungarisches Reich, Hungarian-dominated territory. In the 1780s, the great Habsburg Emperor Joseph II, reformer, had worked out a kind of parallel usage of his own, of playing on the ambiguity of these two words in German. On the one hand, he would say Das Reich and mean, of course, the Holy Roman Empire. He was, of course, the emperor of that. On the other hand, Joseph II, this is a fact that's not well known, he also said Mein Reich, my empire, meaning just the Austrian state that he hoped to bring together and construct. The ultimate ideal of the 70 million person Reich, which emerges in the 1840s, was to get these two to coincide. So the Austrian dominated space that is Habsburg with this old Holy Roman Empire. Okay, so now my three episodes. Central figure from the early 19th century, the central figure for the first episode that I want to recount in the adventures of the word Reich in Habsburg history is Prince Clemens Lothar von Metternich, the leading Austrian minister from 1809, a man deeply aware of the promise and the failure of Joseph's efforts to unify the state. Metternich presided over a shift from 1812 to the 1840s, from the Habsburg state hardly uttering the word Reich to describe itself to its gradually embracing and using the word in this twofold manner. The beginnings of the shift took place very quietly within the Austrian bureaucracy. In 1812, a memo went out telling officials that it was now possible to use the words unser Reich, our Reich, to describe the Habsburg lands. But this was possible chiefly for appearance's sake. The alternative historical terms that were derived from the past, hereditary states, hereditary lands, Erbstaaten, Erbländisch, these seemed in the minds of the top officials too weak. They seemed non-imperial. Not so much wrong as embarrassing. The word in German is mehr oder minder kompromittierend. And so a notation was added to this order that there was to be absolutely no discussion of the order of why it was being issued. Metternich said that a discussion would not be prudent, redlich. The order was therefore to be communicated from the top throughout the bureaucracy by way of a quiet intimation, very Austrian, mittelst einer stillen Intimation. So Austria's official history as Reich began so quietly that no one was meant to hear it, even hear it beyond a few select officials. An empire embarrassed to be an empire, or not knowing what the word would mean. Not surprisingly, the new usage had little to no effect. And in fact, hardly appears, if you look in Google Books, hardly appears in published works until the 1840s. And so in 1822, a reminder was issued in the midst of a lot of other bureaucratic data that this usage was possible. But this reminder of 1822 wasn't actually published until 1829. Okay, somehow seems a very Austrian kind of story. Why all this secrecy? I believe the government was hesitant to embrace the idea of Reich because of the unsettled political situation in Germany. Though Reich was an ancient word in the context, though Reich was an ancient word in the context of Europe, after 1815, the word Reich had revolutionary implications. Right? It's a very, very odd sort of combination, ancient word with revolutionary implications. And it disturbed states of Central Europe interested in stability. Ironically, these states, you see them here, some of them, Bavaria, Württemberg, Baden, these restoration states, existed in their present supposedly legitimate form because they had, as mentioned, usurped territories from other member states of the Holy Roman Empire. So that very old word was a danger to that time's kings and princes. At the same time, looking forward, for nationalists who wanted to promote a new kind of German unity of the German people, das Deutsche Volk, Reich was the natural choice for their new aspiration. A new Germany had at least to fit in the boundaries of the old empire and should be even larger to embrace the entire German people. But their plans relied on popular legitimacy. The German national movement was a popular movement in a way that Metternich, of course, considered revolutionary and unacceptable. In the following decades, challenges emerged to the Vienna Order of 1815 from liberal nationalist movements, causing Metternich gradually to insist that the Reich tradition had to be applied to Austria more openly. We note a shift around the year 1840. In Prussia, Frederick William III was replaced by the more aggressive Frederick William IV, and a more assertive France hinted at designs on territory in the German Rhineland. National movements in Germany, but also Italy and Hungary, grew rather than subsided. So the response, the approach of the government could not simply be suppression. There had to be a positive image, a plan, a message, something to inspire, to make Austria seem a player, relevant, in and beyond Germany. Metternich, as well as Austrian publicists, embraced the idea of Reich. Metternich did so, as you might expect, in a more conservative and more restrained way. His hope was to make Austria cohesive culturally as a German state whose power would radiate, making Austria a leading force in Germany while maintaining Germany as a confederation, a Staatenbund of princes and not a Bundesstaat. And of course, keeping the Austrian Empire intact. This was all a tall order. In July 1847, Metternich told the Prussian ambassador as follows. This is translated from the German. Austria isn't, this is the first usage of this word I find by Metternich, by the way, in this form, 1847. Austria is an empire, a Reich, which includes under its rule peoples of differing nationality. But as a Reich, it has one nationality. Austria is German. German by virtue of its history, by virtue of the core of its provinces, by virtue of its civilization. This, by the way, this document, to my knowledge, has not been cited for 100 years. Found it through Google. I'll tell you more about that if you're interested. That same month, he wrote the Austrian representative in St. Petersburg that within our empire, unser Reich, there were 4 types of Slavism, so Slavic movements, in which the Polish was the most dangerous. But the empire had to fight this evil in various ways. The most important way was to strengthen the German element across Austria. The previous year, 1846, there had been a revolution in southern Poland, in Austrian-controlled Galicia. Metternich had written in an internal memorandum as follows: Galicia needs promotion of the German element. By promotion, I do not mean what might easily be considered to be Germanization. A people, Volksstamm, can only be transformed into another people with the assistance of time. The promotion of the German element should be pursued by maintaining it and its influence with all possible means. That is, civilization in the real meaning of the word. This includes promoting the acquisition of property by Germans, raising up the German middle class, helping spread the German language in schools and other ways as well. He was comfortable saying in the same pages that no Reich was nationality more honored than in the Austrian Kaiserreich, precisely because in his view, the actual substance of nationality was negligible. For Metternich, nationality, nationalism was a glittering costume that encased something real and dangerous, and that something was the overturning of order. Polonism, he wrote, so the Polish national movement, is just a formula, a wording, ein Wortlaut, behind which stands revolution in its most garish and extreme form. Like our day's national theory constructivists, he thought nationality and culture were easily malleable. In 1817, he had even devised a plan for dividing the monarchy into 6 zones and to foster a regional identity in each one of them, while promoting the German element in all of them. Poles in Galicia, for example, would become Galicians and forget that they were Poles. Their elites would be Germanized gradually. One can call this soft denationalization. Thus, if the Austrian state supported museums and primary schools in Polish or Czech, this was done not out of respect, but out of the self-confidence of a higher culture. So we get to the issue of perspective that I mentioned at the very beginning. This attitude was, of course, sensed by others. It terrified Czech and other Slavic national movements because they saw its aspiration as a continuation of the slow assimilation that had been happening for many generations and led to the disappearance of Slavs in Lusatia, Silesia, and elsewhere. Younger writers were bolder than Metternich, wanting Austria to stand at the head of a united Germany, but also much more. In one of the most influential books to appear in these years, Austria and Its Future, 1847, right-leaning liberal Victor von Andrian-Wehrburg wrote that for Austria, a prime consideration was its connection to two entities, Germany, all of Germany, and the Danube estuary. To Germany, Austria was bound by a 2,000-year history and by descent, language, custom, and education, and to the Danube along its entire stretch leading into the Black Sea by trade interests. Given the 2,000 years of brotherhood, it would be easy for Austria to reestablish its position in Germany, according to Andrian Wehrburg. After all, the Austrian name once stood gloriously at the pinnacle of the Holy Roman Empire. This is the beginning of this project I mentioned earlier, the project that goes under the name 70 million person empire, 70 million Reich, including not just the monarchies, nationalities, but also, if you've noted the geography, all Serbs and Romanians. He did not ask about the sentiments, the desires of these non-Germans. Now to my second episode. Just months after these lines were printed, revolution broke out across Europe and Metternich fled. I think I have a map here, which is I can use that. Okay, great. Yep. Okay, great. This is not, yeah. Okay, so a few months after these lines were printed, revolution broke out across Europe and Metternich fled to England. Now three variants of empire animated politics in Central Europe for about a year and a half after that. The first was a liberal German idea. The liberal German idea was straightforward. It involved including all Germans in a national state. The idea of the creators of this, those who wanted to create this, this state, German liberals, was a German constitutional monarchy, which they called, and this is a little recognized fact, a Deutsches Reich. So the liberals and Democrats wanted also to reestablish an empire. They were divided on whether Austria could be included, but voted in a bare majority in favor. Yet, of course, not imagining including Austria's non-German lands as part of Germany, thus, in a sense, voting to destroy the Habsburg monarchy. In April 1849, the Prussian king, Frederick William, rejected the crown of this new empire presented to him by liberals and later introduced his own constitution in Prussia. So that's the end of that story for the time being. The second variant in 1848 was Austrian. It emerged as a challenge to this small German version of Germany and had echoes of Adrian Wehrburg's idea. On the 9th of March, 1849, Prince Felix von Schwarzenberg, high Austrian official, proposed in a letter to the Frankfurt Parliament, where the German liberals were attempting to make a Germany, he proposed a Reich that would include the German Confederation as well as all Habsburg lands. So it's that black space in the center of the map. But in contrast to the hopes of German Democrats to create a German empire based in rule of the people, Schwarzenberg's plan would be a union not of nations or peoples, but of princes, of which the Habsburgs would be the leader, as they had been in the Old Reich. Okay, there's a third variant of empire, and this involves the small peoples of the Habsburg realm. Hungary, with Habsburg consent, had held elections and passed its own basic laws, its own constitution, in March of 1848, recognized by the crown. In April, but from then from the summer of 1848, the monarchy, as you may know, tried to step away from its obligations to Hungary, ultimately leading to war. Bohemia, go back maybe to Bohemia at the center of this map, had been part of the Holy Roman Empire. It was part of the German Confederation. So the delegates writing the Constitution for Germany and Frankfurt on the Main assumed it would be part of the new Germany. Within Bohemia, Germans voted loyally for a new German state in April of 1848, the first elections ever held in Germany, while Czechs overwhelmingly boycotted these elections. First free elections Germany ever knew. The best exemplar of this Czech boycott of these elections held for a new Germany in the Czech lands was the historian and statesman František Palacký. In April 1848, the German politicians in Frankfurt invited Palacký to join their deliberations. After all, he lived in the center of what the map told them was Germany. If you look at the map, you'll see that. So today's Czech Republic, entirely within German Confederation. Palacký responded with thanks, but declined participation. He said, "I'm a Bohemian of Slavic origin, and Bohemia is not Germany." But he worried that by creating a greater Germany, including Austria's German lands, the architects of the new Germany would destroy the Austrian state. So this basic story, I think, is well known, and you may have heard about this before. This basic story of Palacký's lauding Austria and its necessary place in Europe. What is less known for readers of English is that his response suffers from a mistranslation. What you usually read is the following in English: "Truly, if the Austrian Empire had not already been long in existence, we would have to hurry and create it in the interest of Europe and the interest of humanity itself." It sounds like it's a plug for the empire. In fact, he didn't use the word empire. He wrote Kaiserstadt, emperor state. Further, Palacký did not allude to the tradition of the Reich, which from the beginning, from the times of Otto I in the 10th century, had been a German-dominated entity. And more important, he did not share Schwarzenberg's idea of a Central European empire that would be a union of princes, Staatenbund. His idea, rather, was a Völkerverein, a union of peoples. In fact, he imagined the Austrian state of the future as a kind of anti-monarchy. And I'll quote his letter now, interesting section of it. "The southeast of Europe, along the borders of the Russian Empire, is inhabited by a number of peoples who are distinctly different in heritage, language, history, and behavior. Slavs, Romanians, Magyars, Germans, not to mention Greeks, Turks, and Albanians, of which none is powerful enough to defy successfully the all-powerful neighbor in the East for all time," by which he meant Russia. "They can only do this if they are united by a single and strong bond. The true artery of this necessary union of peoples, this Völkerverein, is the Danube." Okay, so not the Habsburg monarchy, the Danube. Putting these words in the context of our time, consider the paradox. The politician who, in line with our current sensibility, believed that nationhood was a word, and that states and nationalists create nations and not the other way around, was the reactionary, the crusher of human freedom, the jailmaster and censor, the peace and order keeper Metternich, the politician who now would seem antiquated and out of touch with our current wisdom about the supposedly secondary and ephemeral nature of national identity, was the liberal, the enemy of imperialism, the man who thought nationhood was real and based in history and language, Palacký. As the words just cited indicate, he was not a so-called primordialist. There was a certain plasticity in his vision. Slavs, for instance, might form nations in various ways. I wasn't sure exactly how, as would Romanians. He was also not a chauvinist. His vision had room for Germans and Turks as regional and not imperial peoples. The important thing was the principle, the idea that nationhood was not just a state-building principle, but the state-building principle. But there could be a community, a cooperative community of small nations. In fact, there had to be, with the Russian Empire in the background. Okay, now I move to my final episode. This is the aftermath of 1848. Following the collapse of the revolutions by 1849, the Habsburgs continued to claim leadership within the German Confederation, while Prussia did all it could to block Habsburg efforts to realize its vague hopes to provide over a 70 million strong state. Okay, so there's a Prussian-Austrian dualism that lasts all the way until July 1866, with the devastating Prussian victory over Austria at Sadowa, or Königgrätz. After this, the Habsburg monarchy had to turn away from Germany. and an undisputed claim on the term Das Reich shifted northward. After Prussia's next victory in France in 1870, there would be for the first time an emperor in Berlin, Kaiser. The new entity was generally called Das Kaiserreich. People meant Germany when they said that. And the Reichskanzler, the Reich Chancellor, was Bismarck. Meanwhile, further south in 1867, the House of Habsburg ceased being even a Kaisertum, an empire state, emperor state, and became the dual monarchy, Austria-Hungary, two states with two citizenships. Simply to maintain order, Francis Joseph had cut a deal with the fractious Hungarian elite, which had been boycotting Habsburg institutions and refusing to pay taxes. Thus, Hungary's elites came to control over more than half the old Kaisertum, including today's Slovakia, Hungary, and parts of Croatia, Romania, Serbia, and Ukraine. Doesn't actually show the subdivisions. But students, I always have to remind them that Hungary at that time is not the Hungary of our time, much, much bigger. However, within the dual monarchy, the word Kaiser did not disappear. Francis Joseph held on to this term. And if you went to Vienna, you encountered a Reichsrat, a parliament, as well as a Reichsgericht, judiciary, Reichsgesetzplatz. There was a issuing of laws, of Austrian laws, was called the Reichsgesetzblatt. The monarchies, universities taught the Reichsgeschichte, history of the Reich, meaning Austrian history. And although there was officially no Reich, Austria after 1867 was the dual monarchy, the monarchy's two halves were called Reichshälften, halves of the emperor. So there were two halves, but no whole. Even more interesting, if one looks to what people were saying, just when empire no longer existed in any terms on Austrian territory, suddenly people could not stop calling the monarchy not just Kaisertum, but Reich. The expression Habsburger Reich was not completely unknown. So Habsburg Empire in German was not completely unknown before 1867. But the proliferation of this word after about 1879 is breathtaking. And by the 1890s, it's everywhere. Habsburg Empire, referring not just to the past, but also to the present. So what was going on here? Why is everybody calling something an empire that ceased even to be a state? In part, I think it was the wholesale embrace of the word Reich after 1850 by the monarchy under Francis Joseph. I'm not fully sure why this happened. But you see it if you look at school books and geographies and encyclopedias in the 1850s, it's there. It's being propagated. The state that Francis Joseph hoped to reform after 1859, he wanted to create a kind of constitutional system, was to be called a Reich, was to be called empire, until 1867, and the division of the territory made that impossible. But by that point, the word was clearly seeping into broad popular usage. But just because people use the word doesn't tell us exactly what they meant. Peter Judson has advanced the idea that people in the monarchy were not just bystanders, but active in co-creating empire. He uses in his German translation of his very important work, he uses the word Reich. Unser Reich, our empire. Judson writes, far from passive receptors of empire, local leaders and societies engaged with the Habsburg dynasty's efforts to build a unified and unifying imperial state. Austrians and Hungarians claimed an explicit stake in their empire. Earlier in the book, Peter Judson calls citizens of the monarchy Austro-Hungarians. So I believe his intent using Austro-Hungarians to talk about the people across the monarchy is to focus on citizenship, on the population as a whole, irrespective of ethnicity or religion, irrespective of nationalism. However, if one takes the non-imperial view that I was suggesting we should keep in focus, one finds that many Austrian and Hungarian citizens, especially of Slavic nationalities, did not consider themselves Austrians, let alone Hungarians. What about them? Did they also say, our empire, unser Reich? I was especially curious about the Czechs, who generally considered Austrians to be foreigners, and whose political class was enraged by not getting a deal in 1867, like the one the Habsburgs accorded the Hungarians. And therefore, the Czech political elite periodically boycotted politics in Vienna. However, when I did research through, thanks Google Books. It turns out that this basic story was very similar. There was little to no use of the Czech equivalent of our empire, unser Reich, naši Žiži, pardon my pronunciation, before about 1870. But after that, there's a proliferation of the use of this term just as in the German lands, so that by the 1890s, everybody is saying it, the Czech equivalent of our Reich. But what did Czech speakers mean? One reference I found is from the Bohemian Parliament in 1887. So Palacký's son-in-law, also a politician, was old Czech leader František Ladislav Rieger. In 1887, he put forward a resolution to create an institution that would show lasting reverence for the emperor, for Francis Joseph, who would soon be celebrating 40 years of rule. The proposal was passed unanimously. However, throughout his remarks, Rieger took care as often as possible to refer to Francis Joseph not only as our Kaiser, our emperor, but also as our king, the king of Bohemia. That is, he leveraged empire for the sake of the nation. Of course, no nation was as loyal to the king as the Czech, he said. The Czech nation, however, did more than simply engage with empire. Rieger claimed that the Czechs' forefathers, the supposed proprietors of the Czech lands from time immemorial, had of their own free will given, as he said, the impetus to create the Austrian Empire in good conscience. In this empire, they find support and backing of the other United Nations. So not just our empire, but we are co-creators of this empire. According to Rieger, the Czechs loved the civilization brought by our empire more than anyone else. He actually said the flowering of civilization of the empire. He also took a moment to sympathize with the difficult plight of the emperor, admiring how, despite the complexity of the realm, the emperor managed to keep peace and promote progress. To these remarks, there are lots of applause and salutations from Rieger's fellow Czechs. Peter Judson has called the Habsburg monarchy a liberal empire, but I am not sure the term liberal applies here. Rieger's behavior and that of the other Czechs in attendance was fawning on the monarch. It was not arguably liberal. The tone throughout was obsequious, opportunistic, giving evidence of the attitude not of a citizen, but of a subject, to whom rights, to whom a constitution have been accorded by the grace of a sovereign, ruling by supposed divine right, and not gained by the acts of the people. In 1848, so 40 years earlier, Rieger, as a young man, had wanted rule of the people by the people. He had wanted democracy of a sort. Yet, like other Central European liberals, his liberalism was corrupted as he pursued nationalism. By 1887, he had become hyper loyal because of all the gifts he claims the Habsburgs had showered upon the Czechs, progress and civilization. Where were we before 1849, before Francis Joseph, he asked? Where were we? What were we? The answer is we were poor peasants. We owe everything to the wise emperor. Again, he subordinated the rhetoric of empire, our empire, to the rhetoric of nationalism. So here we have another paradox. As liberal democracy grew from the early century, it generated nationalism. That is, a political world where demands were raised for basic respect for nationalities and their cultures. But nationalism, tethered to the ultimate rule of a monarch, this was also true in Germany, could corrupt liberalism. If you want a real whiff of liberal spirit in this time, turn to John Stuart Mill. He praised English people's love of liberty and law and said, in all questions between a government and an individual, the presumption in every Englishman's mind is that the government is wrong. The presumption in Rieger's mind seemed to be just the opposite. In the end, Rieger's exceeding loyalty did not achieve satisfactory results in the eyes of many Czechs. And he and his cohort were booted out of office. At his death in 1903, the basic goal of equality for Czechs was still far out of reach. This was a view in 1903 expressed not, as you might expect, by nationalists, by people on the right wing, but by people on the left wing, by Czech social democrats, believers in class struggle, as international as one got among Czechs or any Central European people. Like Rieger, Czech social democrats cared deeply about the substance of nationalism, namely about culture and language. They eulogized Rieger in 1903, but only very briefly, because despite, or perhaps by virtue of his pacting with the monarchy and the upper classes, Rieger had failed to achieve anything like equality for the Czechs. One socialist author wrote, that in the eyes even of the German left, any shack was good enough for a Slavic school. Like Rieger, Czech socialists spoke of our empire, but they communicated something different. There was nothing eternal about the empire, in their view. It was, as far as they could tell, in fact, in its death throes. Because of the basic undemocratic manner in the way that it was constituted. The most direct evidence of its inexorable dissolution was the inability of the Austrian and the Hungarian halves to agree on a joint budget. In their view, Austria-Hungary were evolving into two medium-sized power. But they asked, would that be so bad? No, in fact, that would be welcome development. Why? Because the whole point of these two Reichshälfte, the two halves of the supposed empire, trying to come to an agreement on finances was to permit Austria-Hungary not so much to be, but to seem to be an empire. So what we see at Rieger's death is a syndrome going back almost exactly a century. The point of the Habsburg monarchy, above all else, was not to permit anyone to doubt that its rulers had the right to call themselves imperial. What these negotiations of the two sides, the Reichshälften, were trying to achieve in this very sharp criticism of the Czech socialists was to raise sufficient funds to build at least as many cannons and battleships, they write Kriegsschiffe, using a Germanic word, as the imperial neighbors, while education, justice, public wages, workers' insurance suffered. So let the empire dissolve into two medium-sized states, no problem. The fixed idea, I quote Social Democrats, the fixed idea of the Austrian statesmen about the great power status of the empire has come very dear to us, dear in the sense of costly. In this 1903 piece, Czech Social Democrats called the empire's political system not liberal, but absolutist. But of course, paradoxically, the fact that they could write such things is evidence again of this sort of muddled aspect of Austrian politics. It's evidence of, in fact, a certain liberality of rule in Cisleithania. So liberal empire is not entirely wrong in that sense. But the socialists believed in history, they believed in popular power, they didn't despair. They assumed that when Austria became popularly governed as they thought it would evolve into the kind of order that Palatsky had imagined. And I'll quote their statement: "We urgently need a parliament with a broad European perspective, into which the conviction from the lower layers of the citizenry would penetrate that linguistic equality and national federation are the only basis on which Austria's future can be built as an international federal state in the heart of Europe." Please note, federal state, not empire. Implicitly, the socialists raised the question of whether any state called an empire can be ruled by the consent of the governed. So I have, in conclusion, 5 brief remarks, and then I'll be interested in your comments or questions. Robert Kann had perhaps the most satisfactory approach to the question of empire. In English usage, there's no doubt, there's no question. Extensive space, numerous peoples, yes, Habsburg Empire. But when the German word Reich intrudes, the issue is trickier. The monarchy had problems using that word to describe itself before 1850 when it wholeheartedly embraced it, apparently because Prince Metternich and also Francis II and I worried about misunderstandings, suspecting that once people of their age tried to recreate Reich, the consequences would be revolutionary and perhaps destructive. The attitude began to change as it is described in the 1840s. If one wanted to remain a player in Central Europe, whether monarchist or Democrat, or liberal or conservative, or indeed later fascist, whether Prussian or Austrian, one had to invoke this word. But empire as Reich was arguably not an ideal for humanity. When German speakers used the term Das Reich or Unser Reich, they assumed a German-dominated entity with a mission to spread civilization, quote unquote, eastward to the neighboring peoples that Julius Ficker mentioned at the outset of this talk. So if the Habsburg Empire looks fabulous, Mies van Dijk made this point many years ago, when compared to what came later, Hitler, Stalin, Milosevic, that does not mean it was liberal, let alone democratic, or possessed a structure that had figured out a way of ensuring coexistence in peace and justice of a variety of peoples. Second point, it behooves us to see the monarchy from the perspective of those people who often referred to the Austrians as colonial rulers. Habsburg Empire, Cisleithania that is, was of course relatively moderate and tolerant compared to other empires, not just of later times, but of its time. The Russian Empire had an incomparably more vigorous homogenizing agenda in the 1880s and 90s. However, the basic relation was the same: an empire, here in Vienna, there in Moscow or London, assuming it represented a superior civilization. Therefore, calling Czechs Austrians or calling Slovaks Hungarians is like calling Poles or Ukrainians living under Tsarist rule Russians. It's like calling the Irish British. It's like calling the Ukrainians Russians, in the most recent manifestation of Russian imperialism. Third point, to see the non-imperial view, one has to focus on what was at stake, ultimately. Not so much economic development and material civilization, the things that Rieger was able to laud, but language. The point of the East European national movement, something Western writers on nationalism, as well as the great theorists like Gellner and Hobsbawm, tend to underrate, is that languages are specific and not interchangeable. In fact, many words can only be roughly translated or not translated at all, like the word Reich. As an experienced mode of community enabling solidarity, humans possess no resource arguably more precious than language. Evidence of this occurred when people like Joseph II or Bismarck or Nicholas II in Russia tried to crush language that always produces national. There are very few people when pushed, who when pushed is the important phrase, will say, I do not care about my language, who are indifferent to language. So Gary Cohen asked whether I would have a rejoinder today to his generous review of my book, and I will provide a brief one. It would be this. So I don't dispute that if you follow the literature, nationally indifferent people indifferent to nationality existed in Central Europe. I think that if I lived back in the old empire, I would have preferred their company. Certainly probably a more interesting, a more fun crowd than the nationalists, it's true. But in the region as a whole, the nationally indifferent, people indifferent to language and culture, were numerically not significant. And as the word indifferent suggests, they did not have great interest in politics. Among people who had interest in politics, left, right, or center, and left is very important here, people who made history for good and for bad, one could not be indifferent to language, especially if the argument could be made within one's political world that one's community, one's language speakers, fellow language speakers, were not respected. For example, Czech by German speakers. No Czech politician could ignore that. This resentment became an obsession. At least that's how it seems to people on the outside, looking from the comfort of Minnesota or California. For insiders, from people within Bohemia in the 19th century, the perspective was this: an issue of elemental justice was at stake. As Herder said, and that is why Herder was so popular, the issue was defending the language not so much of oneself as of one's parents and grandparents, as of one's family. This is an insight that I think it doesn't take a lot of hard work to promote, the thrust of the nationalist message. But there's also the question, this is a different point, there's also the question of the justice of our own perspective. But to see that requires going beyond the old monarchy, so going outside of the Habsburg lands for a moment. Historians, and this is German history now, historians of 1848 record this splendid story of German men going to the polls to vote for the very first time in April of 1848, Bavaria, Hesse, everywhere, casting ballots, hoping to create their own national state. Virtually nobody watching this or writing about it says they were or should have been nationally indifferent. Virtually everyone says Germans had a right to want a national state. And through democratic means in April 1848, they elected representatives whose job it was to make that national state, among whose functions would be protecting and promoting German language and culture. No one says this was unnatural, to my knowledge. 40 million Germans should have been, let alone were, nationally indifferent. Okay, so if it was okay for Germans to form their national state, why not for Czechs? That's my question to Habsburg historiography. And why should we act as if forming a national state is such a bad thing? We have one in the USA, right? And virtually every democracy is one. The point is to make nationalism work in a liberal manner and not deny people's right to realizing and defending their nationality as they understand it. Americans do it in the United States. Why should not Poles, Czechs, or for that matter, Ukrainians? Okay, so that's my third point, and I have two brief ones, and then I'll be finished. The fourth one is on the untranslatable word Reich. It's not empire, at least not precisely. Reich tended to be more homogenizing. It was situated where no one expects empire, not across oceans and continents, but at the heart of Europe, where the colonial peoples, Slavs, appear to be the same culture as the colonizers, at least in the eyes of people looking at it from Minnesota and California. The Reich, its ambitions to dominate, were registered not in far-flung outposts as one expects from empire, but in places we, coming from the US, North America, and perhaps other places in Western Europe, I sometimes think having an imperial mindset, recognized not as colonies at all. Places like Prague. So my first visit to Prague in 1980, I was told by somebody that Prague was in fact a colony. So it's always stuck with me from that moment. He was trying to change money with me, by the way. What is interesting, I think, about Julius Ficker and his words is that he was not a right-winger. He was not a nationalist, let alone a proto-fascist, but a man of reason. He was a man who loved nothing more than sitting over dusty volumes of history. Yet he stated very clearly the basic structure of the word that people did not disagree about, and its implication that it meant domination of other peoples. Finally, point 5, neither the Habsburg Reich project nor the more assertive Prussian version proved stable in the late 19th century. Perhaps the very word Reich made that impossible. After the collapse of both Imperial Austria and Imperial Germany in 1918, populations in Germany and Austria wanted unity. And guess what form they wanted it in? A Reich. The Allies did not permit that to happen. Nevertheless, the parliamentarians, the Democrats, the liberals and social democrats who went to Weimar in Germany in 1919 to write a constitution. What did they call the constitution? Reichsverfassung. What did they call? We call it the Weimar Republic. What did they call their state? Das Deutsche Reich. However, flipping a little further ahead, a democracy could not live up to the standards of a Reich, at least not in the eyes of very many Germans and Austrians. When after 1933, a German chancellor who came from Austria promised to make a Reich, including most of the empire's old territories, many, if not most, Austrian and Bohemian Germans found the idea irresistible. Sudeten German Party, for example, elections of the 1930s. Virtually everyone who embraced the Reich term after the decline of the old Reich in 1806 was playing with fire. Prince Metternich, I have to say something positive about him, is one of the few people I think who understood that. And maybe it's no coincidence that it was only in 1945, when the Reich was finally dead and soon buried. And Roosevelt, by the way, was very focused on making sure the Reich did not reemerge, even as a word. It was only then in 1945 that Austro-Germans could finally be what they are now, simply Austrians, with the aspiration of governing themselves, but not neighboring peoples, the Nachbarvölker. Okay, so with that, I bring my comments to a conclusion, and thank you for your attention.